Thank you, Ken. Good morning. What a blessing it is to be here with you, and I want to welcome our visitors who are with us today. As we look together at this passage and something that is so close and near to the heart of God, to welcome those who are the least among us, to show hospitality to the least among us. And so as we start this morning, I want you to think of an example in your own life where you felt like an outsider. It could be maybe when you went on a trip, or you wanted to go to an activity and you didn't know the people who were there, or you tried to join a group. But I want you to think of an example in your life when you felt like an outsider. So be thinking about that for the next few minutes as I'm talking, because I'm going to invite you to share a little bit about that with your neighbors. So be thinking about that for the next few minutes. As we think about that, I wanted to just think together with you about the story we have in Matthew chapter 2 about Jesus and the flight to Egypt. Do we really recognize that there was a time in our Lord's life where he and his family all felt like outsiders? And I found this painting this past week, and I thought it was so interesting. It's by Edwin Long. And I don't know if you can fully see everything that's in the background, but here we have Joseph, Mary, and Jesus coming into Egypt. And look at all the symbols and the vestiges of the Egyptian culture surrounding them as they come in. We have here idols in the background of Egyptian gods. We have all these different symbols around them of Egyptian life. And think of how uncomfortable that must have been for this family coming from Judea, a place where Yahweh, the one God of Israel, was worshipped. And they come into this land, they don't know anybody, and here the people of this land worship different gods and have a different culture. Think of how hard that would have been. And while we think about that, we have to recognize this is part of God's story. That he chose to send Jesus, his son, into the world in such a way that he would have to endure this. Why would our God choose that for his own son? To be a foreigner in Egypt, to be among a people who were not his own. Why would he choose to send him into a humble family amidst the persecution by the local governor, Herod? Why would he choose this for Jesus? So as we think about that, I want to go back to your story. Now I want you to turn to your neighbor or somebody near and tell them about an instance in your life where you felt like an outsider. So just take a few minutes to go ahead, if you would, turn to the person next to you and just mention a little bit about the time in your life where you felt like you were an outsider. Thank you very much for taking that time to share. And now that we've had a little time to talk about how it felt to be an outsider, I want to ask you about hospitality. Because when you were an outsider, you know what it's like to hunger and thirst for hospitality. So what does hospitality mean to you? Now, Ken gave us wonderful reflection on hospitality at the beginning. Thank you, Ken. That was great. Sincerity, empathy, a few of the words that Ken used to describe hospitality, and I agree with him. Those are very important. What other words come to your minds when you think of hospitality? What other words come to your mind? Sacrifice. Good. Doing things together. Thanks, Janine. Openness. Pardon? Did somebody say sharing? Sharing. Great. Thank you. Welcome. Very good. Pardon? At peace. Giving. Absolutely. Paul.
I think recognizing that the people you're hosting or interacting with might be different from you, so knowing that you may have to provide more explanation or more instruction than you might otherwise. So just recognizing that someone isn't the same as you.
Oh, that's good, Paul. Realizing that the person you may be serving as a host to is different from you, have differences from you. And on that note, I thank you. I want to look with you at what the New Testament means when it uses the term hospitality. The Greek word in the New Testament for hospitality is comprised of two separate words brought together. The first word is love, and the second word is stranger. So philo, love, xenia, stranger. That's the New Testament word for hospitality. Does this surprise you? Does this surprise you a little bit? That the New Testament defines hospitality as love of stranger, the one who, as Paul said, has differences from us? I find it surprising. I never knew that. And I looked it up. I thought, oh, that is interesting. What an interesting thought. So that brings us back to the initial question I asked about our painting. Why do you think God would choose to send his son into the world, and then right away, when he's just a little child, he'd have to go into exile with his family into a foreign land? Why? Why? I'd like for you to turn in your scriptures to Isaiah chapter 42, verse 6. In the Pew Bible, you can find that on page 703. Page 703 of the Pew Bible. This is Isaiah chapter 42, verse 6. And this is a really important passage about Jesus. It's unpacking for us what God's servant, what the Messiah is going to be called to do when he comes on this earth. And so this reveals God's heart. It reveals the calling of Jesus. And this, in my opinion, is the answer to why he was sent into Egypt. Let's look at verse 6. Let's listen carefully. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord. That is my name. So right away, we're told that Jesus, as the Messiah, is going to have a special calling, not just to the people of Israel, but God is going to make him a covenant that will extend to the Gentiles. Another translation of that term in the Old Testament could be the nations. And so Jesus, from the very beginning, was going to be called into this role of bringing God's message of hope and of grace to people of all backgrounds in the world. And so, of course, when God sends his son, the very way he sends him in at the beginning of his story is going to involve Jesus going to people of other backgrounds. Jesus is going to go and be an outsider because God himself desires that people from Egypt, people from Syria, people from all around the world of that time and today would have access to his son and his grace and his message. Think about Jesus' life for a little bit. Think about some of the people that he reached out to, some of the despised people of his day that he reached out to, and it really embodies this passage even more. So what were some examples of people that Jesus reached out to that would have been considered unfavorable or despised? Can you think of some examples? Tax collectors. Great example. Lepers. Pardon? Samaritans. Right. Absolutely. Women. Mm-hmm. The Gerasene demoniac. That's right. Mm-hmm. So Jesus models for us something about the heart of God, and it's revealed to us in the Isaiah passage that God's calling for his son is to include the outsider, the stranger. So there's something really important about this that I think we need to talk about, because right away when we talk about this idea of stranger, there's a tension, and it's a tension inherent in the meaning of the term. So if you think of the Old Testament, you know, for example, and Geraldo talked about this last week, that there are a number of passages in the law of Moses that safeguard the stranger who are among the people of Israel. You know, that they shouldn't, their wages should be fair. They should not be overworked. They should have good opportunities to thrive as they're among the people of Israel. So on the one hand, the law of Moses in the Old Testament, and it's clear to see God wants his people to show love to their neighbor, to the stranger in their land. But on the other hand, you have these passages in the Old Testament that caution the children of Israel against foreign nations and people from other backgrounds and cautions them about the ways of these nations. And so I think it's really important we just stop for a second and say, on the one hand, you have this call to love your neighbor. certainly in the Old Testament and then certainly brought into the New Testament. But on the other hand, you have this caution about what is foreign in foreign cultures and particularly in foreign religions. And so I think we just need to name that today, and to make sense of where Jesus is going, we have to realize what he's doing is he's not changing that paradigm. What he's really unpacking for us is saying we have to really wrap our minds around what it means to love your neighbor. And yes, it doesn't mean that we, accept all the foreign elements of another culture, particularly religious things. We still are dedicated to the God of Israel, Jehovah, Yahweh. He is at the core of our worship. But what it means is that we expand our understanding of God's vision for our neighbor to include people from all backgrounds and to recognize our calling is to serve and to love people of all backgrounds. And it's going to take us a while to wrap our minds around that this morning. So I want to think about this particular verse, verse 35 from our passage today, when Jesus says he was a stranger. He was as a stranger to the people standing before him, and they served him. And I want us to think about how that's profound, that Jesus could somehow be present to us in the strangers we encounter. We already talked about the people Jesus reached out to: tax collectors, the poor, Samaritans, people whose society thought were sinful, how he reached out to the Samaritan woman and other women in the Gospels. Those were the strangers that Jesus interacted with. But then he comes in our lives in the same types of individuals, and he's present in those strangers. So we have to think about that for a little bit. And so to really understand this, I think we have to understand who is the stranger in my life and how is Jesus present. We have to look at the second part of the passage here in verse 40, because there's something really important here that unpacks that for us. How do we kind of get at this idea of the stranger? And I think Jesus really talks about it when he says, the least of these. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these, the people around you that he identifies earlier in the passage as the hungry, the thirsty, those needing clothing, the person who was in prison that was visited. These were counted as Jesus as the least of these. Now, some commentators will say Jesus is primarily referring to here the persecuted Christians who are in these conditions. But I think it's also clear to say, if you take Jesus' understanding of love of neighbor, that he's also defining least of these as our calling to extend to all human beings who bear the image of God. So I want us to think a little bit about the least of these. And so I want to invite you to take your Bible again, if you would. And now I want to invite you to turn to Luke chapter 14, verse 12. I think there's something important here for us. Luke chapter 14, starting at verse 12. That's on page 1012 in the Pew Bible, if you're using the Pew Bible. Page 1012. I'm going to begin reading here. Then Jesus said to his host, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So there's something here, if we listen carefully, when Jesus says least of these, when he says, I was a stranger to you as I came to you in your life in the form of the least of these people around you. He's saying, be attentive to the people in your life who can't do anything for you, who aren't going to advance your prestige, your career, your clout. Be aware of those people that come in your life who have needs that aren't going to give you anything or make you necessarily feel better about yourself or are going to benefit you in interacting with. And it's in those people that I invite you to serve and to extend my hospitality, because when you do, you're pleasing my Father in heaven, and you also are serving me. I want you to think about this quote. It's from the Missional Essentials book we've been using. And I want to invite you to read it with me. Will you read this with me? We are not just to receive the stranger when he comes to us, but actually to inquire after and look carefully for strangers, to pursue them and search them out everywhere. I'm just going to let this sink in for a second. This gets at the heart of this whole series we're talking about being missional. I'm going to give you a little quiz here. Once again, what does the basic term mission mean? What does mission mean? Anybody remember? What does mission mean? To send, right? So when we're missional, we're being sent out by God into daily life, into the context of daily life, where we work, where we play, where we interact with others, and where we're at the store. As we're sent out, this is what we're supposed to be doing up here. Okay? We're not waiting passively in our church building or in our home for people to come to us. We are sent out and always attentive to the least of these. Christ's vision for ministry. We're sent out into the world and we're always attentive to the least of these. Does it benefit us that we're doing that in a worldly way? Does it increase our status or prestige? No. Does it please our Father in heaven? Yes. And that's why we seek this and we do this. It's part of our mission. And it's a posture for life. So whenever a visitor comes in, of course we want to welcome them and make them feel at home. But when you're out doing life and you see somebody who's excluded, you see somebody who has needs, seek to show hospitality to them. I'd like to leave you with these 3 challenges, and I would like to invite you to do a little bit of writing right now on the in the little section in the bulletin where there's a sermon title you can write in there, or on a piece of paper if you want to take this with you. But I really want you to try to answer question number 1. Who are the strangers in your community in need of hospitality? Try really hard to be specific here. Is there somebody you know? Is there somebody you think might have a need for hospitality in your life? As much as you can, try to write a specific name or a name of a group, or write something down that you can be reflecting on here. Now that you've had some time to think about that, I want you to think about how you can show hospitality. In what setting can you offer hospitality? So now you've thought of a person. How could you extend hospitality to them? Would it be in your home? Would it be something you can do when you encounter them in public? Is it giving them a gift card, or offering them a time to get together for coffee, or purposely taking time to affirm them and say something positive to encourage them? Think about how you can extend hospitality to them, which context, in your home or where you see them. And then number 3, and this is the tough one. This is because our time is limited and we value so much our discretionary space and time with family and to recharge. What might you have to give up in order to offer hospitality? Think about time out of your schedule or space. There can be a sacrifice to live in this way. So think about what types of things might you have to give up. Is it the convenience of just quickly zipping through the store? If you stop and talk to this person, it will slow you down. Think about that, knowing that we're called to extend hospitality, knowing that that's part of God's heart. And I just want to encourage you, this is it's a journey. It's not like after the Sunday we just enact these things and we've arrived. I think it's just a constant reminder that we always come back to time and time again to extend God's love to others, to take time apart to show hospitality to others. So this is part of a journey that we're on. We said as a church we want to grow in our understanding of mission. So this is going to be an ongoing topic that comes back time and time again. But as you leave today, be inspired. Know God has something good for you to do in this area this coming week. He's going to use you to bless others. Be expecting to encounter others as you're out in the world. Be expecting for God to use you in these places. He will, and he has good things in store.